Up next is an interview conducted as part of our 2022 Congress last month. In it, Global Colon Cancer Association's Andrew Spiegel talks with Leah Christl of Amgen. She is the former biosimilars lead at the Food and Drug Administration, also known as the FDA. Dr. Christl will lay out the basics of biosimilars and some key policy concerns that affect patients.
Well, hello, everyone. Welcome back. And again, my name is Andrew Spiegel, the Executive Director of the Global Colon Cancer Association. And you're going to hear today from our very special guest. I've known Leah for a long time, all the way back when I was a patient advocate in the US only. And Leah was on the FDA and had been in front of the FDA many times talking about the need for patient-centered standards for the approvals of all of these medicines and things of that nature. And now Leah works for industry, which she'll tell you about. And so really excited to have her here, and she's going to explain to you exactly why this is important to all patient advocates, regardless of what disease you're involved with. Biologics and biosimilars are becoming a standard part of the treatment plan for multiple diseases, including colorectal cancer, but rheumatology, dermatology, oncology, so many other areas of medicine, Crohn's and colitis, gastrointestinal. There's so many applications where these biologics and biosimilar medicines have truly made remarkable differences in the lives of patients, and we're going to hear about that. So I want to introduce you to our superstar speaker today. Leah, why don't you tell everyone watching a little bit about your work history and what brings you here today?
I'm very happy to be here to share this time with you. As was said, my name is Leah Christl. I'm an executive director at Amgen, and I focus on biosimilars, regulatory affairs, so focusing on approval and development of products, as well as biosimilars regulatory and research and development policy. So prior to that, as was indicated, I was at the Food and Drug Administration. I was there for about 16 and a half years. And the last portion of time at FDA, from 2010 to 2019, upon my departure, I was the head of the biosimilars program at FDA. So working on establishing that approval pathway for FDA for the development and approval of biosimilar products, as well as policy development, education and outreach, advocacy aspects of biosimilars. So I've been doing biosimilars since 2010. I think like Andy, this is kind of in my blood, something that I'm very passionate about and have been able to carry forward with me into Amgen.
And now some of the audience are saying, okay, great. Now, what in the world are you talking about? What is a biosimilar? What is a biologic drug?
So a biological molecule is something that's produced in a living system. So unlike what we think about is chemically synthesized drugs, which most small molecule drugs are, where we think about, combining chemicals together. And again, as you said, producing that pill form that folks are used to. Biologics are produced in a living system. So these can be grown in bacteria or yeast or mammalian cells in what's referred to as a bioreactor. And the best way that I can explain a bioreactor, the way that people will understand it, is that if you go to a microbrewery and you see those big stainless steel tanks, that's a bioreactor. But instead of beer, we're growing drug products in there. So biological molecules, as Andy indicated, are very large. They can be up to 1,000 times the size of a small molecule drug, such as aspirin. They tend to be very complicated in terms of their structure, and their structure is directly related to what we refer to as their function. So their biological activity, what they do in the body to treat disease. The biological products really revolutionized medicine in terms of what we can do here. As Andy indicated before, these are being used to treat rheumatoid arthritis, psoriasis, gastrointestinal diseases like Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis. And then we have a number of oncology therapies that would be treating a wide range of cancers. And, it really adds not just to quality of life, but again, a lot of these can give patients a real curative standpoint, curing cancer, but then also really giving stability to disease cases where you have chronic diseases like rheumatoid arthritis or psoriasis, and really giving quality of life back to patients. And so it's so important that we pay attention to these drugs.
Some of the stories that I've heard over the years in other settings besides colorectal cancer or oncology are, I've heard from rheumatologists, and particularly the stories that stuck with me were the pediatric rheumatologists that talk about how some of the conferences they went to 20 years ago, all of the kids were in wheelchairs and using walkers. And now when they go to these conferences, because of biologic medicines, all of these kids are playing sports in school. They're living perfectly normal lives because they're taking the right biologic that gives them, as you say, maybe a cure, but if not a cure, it's certainly given them their life back. And we've seen the same thing, as you say, in Crohn's and colitis and in cancer. We now have all these biologic drugs for cancer, and we're seeing the life expectancy, certainly in colon cancer, we've seen the life expectancy go off the charts compared to what it was 20 years ago before any biologic drugs came to market. I recently saw data that said there's over 1 billion people on the planet that have benefited from biologic drugs. Does that sound about right?
Sounds about right to me.
Yeah, I mean, when you think about that, 1 billion people on the planet, that's like 1 out of every 7 people have already taken a biologic drug. We know if you're taking a generic, most people know it pretty much works the same as the brand. But now we're talking about biologic drugs. We're talking about drugs that are made from living, real life organisms. And you can't buy those off of a shelf, right? I can't buy that particular cell line that biologic was made from off the shelf and make that same biologic. So if I'm a generics manufacturer, I've said this, for many years, this whole conversation about following the recipe really doesn't apply because you can't get the same identical ingredients. So what did the FDA do about that? You were at the FDA. You created this whole policy. This was ground world shaking new policy. What did you do about this? We can't create generics. So does that mean the brand manufacturer for biologics gets to not have competition forever? Payers and the government says, no way, right? What did you do?
So FDA created a policy, a framework scientifically that told biosimilar manufacturers what data they had to create and how they had to compare to that reference product, that originator product, to show that they were biosimilar. So what biosimilar means in this space is that it's highly similar on that structural and functional level, and that it has no clinically meaningful difference. So that means that you expect it to have the same safety and efficacy profile as that originator or reference product. FDA's position, global regulators' positions, the expectation is that the biosimilar will have the same safety and efficacy profile as the reference product. So between that originator and the biosimilar, you should expect the same outcome.
Our audience, of course, is global, and regulators around the world have been putting in policies in place for the approval of biosimilar medicines. We know that Europe was first, Canada was right behind them, the US, down in South America, in Brazil, Central America, we see Australia has had them for some time. And other countries around the world are now building programs to approve biosimilar medicines. Could you share with our audience some of the factors that the FDA and EMA and some of the bigger regulatory, more seasoned regulatory bodies have sort of put in place to make sure that biosimilar medicines are safe and effective, just as safe and just as effective as if the person were on an originator biologic?
Sure. So pretty much globally, you see similar standards from what you can refer to as mature regulatory authorities. So, the US FDA, the European Union, European Medicines Agency, Health Canada, the Japan Regulatory Agency, PMDA. So they take a very similar approach in terms of the scientific standards. And again, the underpinnings for any biosimilar program is that structural and functional comparison. It's very, very robust, looking at what, aspects of the molecule's structure play a role in how it functions in the body, and really making sure are, as we have said, highly similar. but also that the manufacturing process is robust and continuously and consistently produces a product that has those same quality attributes that we call them. So the same structural attributes that would lead towards the same function. And that's very well controlled.
And some patients watching this may say, what's this whole thing all about? Why do we need biosimilars if we have the original biologic drugs?
Right. So in the US and then even globally, before there were biosimilars, you just had the originator biological product. And so it was essentially what we refer to as a single source market. And so there was only one biological product, and they pretty much could say, this is how much the product cost. We all know from, competition that's created just in an open marketplace for any type of commerce area, that where you have competition, that a lot of times will lead to lower costs.
There's a danger to having one company manufacturing the one drug for that disease that works, with supply chain issues we're seeing all over the world now in other areas. This could hit that company, an earthquake could hit that company's manufacturing plant, and I know there's contingencies for all of this, but isn't it better to have multiple manufacturers around the world to make sure we have access to that drug at all times? We've seen situations where patients lose access to drugs because there's not enough people and there's shortages.
Right. And not to be flippant by any stretch of the imagination, but we've all gone through, again, the impact on supply chain that we saw from COVID. And I think we're all really, really happy that there's multiple manufacturers that make things like toilet paper.
So you bring up a really good analogy. Let's say this week I go to Costco and I buy Costco toilet paper because it's on sale. And next week I go and I get Cottonelle toilet paper because that's on sale and I'm cheap. And the week after that, you get the point. I go get Charmin the week after that. Probably not going to make a whole lot of difference in my life, right? Which toilet paper I got that month or that week. But what about what we're talking about? What if I'm on a biologic drug and I switch employers and my new employer says, oh, we don't cover that. You have to take a biosimilar drug. And 6 months after that, my employer changes their healthcare plan. And the new healthcare plan says, oh, well, we're under contract with a different manufacturer, a different biosimilar. So you can have a biologic drug and you can have 4 or 5 biosimilars to that same drug, right?
Mm-hmm.
What are some of the issues that patients worry about or physicians worry about, or that we as a community, a patient advocacy community, should be concerned about if a patient's going to be switched from a drug that we know is working for them?
It's really important in that context to make sure that the physician is involved and the patient is involved, and that there's good record keeping. There's going to be, observation of the patient as they're changing medications. I think we have to understand that, this is the reality. You sort of laid out what can happen. You want to make sure that you're well monitored, that you're, what drug you're on, that if you do have a change, you're in touch with your doctor, they're monitoring you. And that if you have any, adverse consequences, loss of efficacy or different, safety issues that would come up, that you make sure that you go back to your doctor or your pharmacist, you have that conversation and see what the best thing is for you.
But when we think about outside the US, where it's not usually a private payer or an insurance company, it's a government. It's a government regulator that has made the decision which drug is going to be available. How have they handled it, say, in Europe, in terms of this forced switching that we're talking about? I mean, what we're talking about is non-medical switching, forced switching. It's switching a patient from one drug to another drug for a non-medical reason, right? We're talking about a change of health plan, or in a single payer system like Europe, where a government decides that they're going to switch people over to a biosimilar from a biologic, or at least make it available. How have they handled that in terms of forcing it or non-forcing it? Have they left the physicians in charge? And how successful has that been, say, in Europe?
Right. So I think that it varies. I think we see different flavors of this. And, in some cases, the physician, does stay involved, where you have those types of policies that are put into place, many times the physician will have the opportunity to say, no, I'm going to keep my patient on the drug that they're on. And that could be in this circumstance now that we have various biosimilars to a given originator or reference product. It might be that originator product, but it could be a biosimilar that they're on, and where you have a patient who's stable on that drug. Many times the physician can say, no, I'm going to keep my patient on this drug. I'm going to change these patients. And then the patients that are just starting on therapy, I'm going to put them on the quote unquote preferred drug that's there. So I think overall in the systems, that's what people would probably globally refer to as the more successful. It's dealing with what payers want to be dealing with. It's, giving oversight and control to prescribers, to physicians, and, it's giving patients peace of mind that where they're stable on therapy, that they're able to maintain on that therapy. So in other situations, we don't have that, where it's just a wholesale switch. As things happen, I think that where you have success around those circumstances, it's where you have communication, you have notification, people are aware of what's happening, and you ultimately would have the opportunity to go back to a certain drug if you were not successful on it. So where you don't have that opportunity, I think that we would categorize those as the less successful systems.
Yeah, and from the patient's perspective, isn't it kind of true that the patients want their physicians to be in charge of their healthcare, not a regulator, not a payer? They want the physician to make the decision about what is the best treatment for them individually. Whereas we see this challenge to that all over the world now. For example, we know up in Canada, there's forced switching that's about to take place or has already started to take place. There's switching that's happening in Australia. And there's these challenges around the world to the doctor-physician relationship of the physician being allowed to make an individual decision for that individual patient based upon their experience with that patient, versus a regulator who's going to say that everybody with that disease now has to be on that drug. And so what is your take on that type of success? We know that Europe, for the most part, has not taken the force switched. They've kept the doctor relevant, and they have, for the most part, let the doctor have autonomy in making those decisions, right?
Yeah. So I think, in those circumstances, it really highlights the role that a patient can play and a patient advocacy organization can play of, where the concerns are, making their voices heard as these policies are being made, that, what is important, as you said, to the patient and to the patient community, and how they want these policies to be put into place, especially in terms of communication, notification, preserving that doctor-patient relationship. So, for those things that are important to the patient community, it's really, really important that people work individually or through their patient advocacy organization, to make their voices heard on these matters and help to influence the policy that's taking place.
So one of the things you mentioned early on was the importance of the ability to track a certain drug to the manufacturer. So if a patient's on a biologic, the originator biologic, and then they're switched to a biosimilar A, and then maybe, sometime in the future, they're switched to biosimilar B, and then maybe they're switched back to the originator. We do see that happening in some countries. And so what protections should be in place or are in place to protect patients when these sorts of things happen?
Right. So globally, this is what we refer to as pharmacovigilance. So, you want to be able in that post-approval environment to know, track, identify what products patients are getting. And so if you do have an adverse event, either loss of efficacy or some, safety issue that occurs, you want to be able to know the drug that patient took, and then take appropriate action. You want regulators to be able to take appropriate action. So with that, successful pharmacovigilance comes from being able to identify that single product. There's various systems across the world to do that. Some of them rely on the brand name, the trade name of that product. Some of them rely on what we refer to in the US as the non-proprietary name. So it's the name of that drug substance. So for example, we have Avastin is a reference product originator product. That's the brand or trade name of that biological product. Bevacizumab is that quote unquote active ingredient or the drug substance that's in it. So FDA put into place a system where that bevacizumab piece, that drug substance or active ingredient piece, then has a suffix that's appended to it. It's a 4-letter suffix, and each bevacizumab biological product has a suffix appended to it. So that way you can tell the difference in the systems. And so as people are prescribing, billing, reporting adverse events, all the systems include that piece of information about the drug.
The WHO has proposed the biological qualifier proposal, which essentially adds 4 letters to the end of the name of a drug. So in your example, if it was Avastin ABCD, then Avastin BCDF or GHCK, whichever it is, there would be 4 random letters assigned to the end of the drug name, which would then allow anyone in the world to be able to identify that drug. And it's in the event a patient has an adverse event, or in the event there has to be some sort of reporting, it would be directly known exactly who made the drug that the patient took.
Yes, I'm familiar with it. I think, some of the struggle with the WHO's proposal and implementing that have been, again, there's different systems globally, and some regulatory authorities, have in place a different system that's been effective, either off of brand name or some other aspect. But also globally, that concept of a suffix is somewhat challenging, where you have language differences, non-meaningful or, nonsensical suffix in one language can mean something in another. So, they had some hurdles implementing that process in the US. I think that the FDA's approach of adding that 4-letter suffix to that drug substance name has been very successful in terms of the pharmacovigilance efforts in the US. And I know that in the European Union, they look again to use brand name in their pharmacovigilance efforts. And, their opinion is that their process is also successful for identifying products down to that individual product level.
Where do you see the role in the global patient community, in the global patient movement? Where do you see the role of the patient or the patient advocate in this whole biologics and biosimilar policy discussion?
This goes beyond just being the advocate with your healthcare provider of, interacting with your doctor. There's an opportunity here for patients to have a voice in policymaking and standard setting. And it's very important globally that patients use their voice, engage with regulators as they're developing policies. There's opportunities at public meetings, providing public comments on regulatory policy, other aspects of that to say, this is what we want to see. We want these scientific standards for approval to remain robust. We want to have confidence in what regulators are doing when they approve products. So for patient advocacy organizations, you need to develop materials that are appropriate for patients to understand. Biologics are complex, the science is complex, but there's ways to explain the complexity from a scientific standpoint, as well as the regulatory policy aspect, the standards that are there to the patient community. FDA has taken some efforts there in working with patient advocacy organizations to develop patient-focused materials, but patients can give feedback, again, to their advocacy organizations as well as to regulators. One of the ways to do that is patient advocacy organizations can create surveys and collect information. And so even if you don't know the answers to the questions that are there, that's good information to feed back to say, I have no idea what you're talking about, because that identifies a need for education.
We are currently doing a survey on patient advocates' knowledge of biosimilars. And I would encourage everybody to take the survey. I can't thank you enough again for your time and your expertise in this area. So thank you very much, Leah.
Thank you. Appreciate the kind invitation. As I said, I love talking about this stuff. Biosimilars is in my blood now after all these years. So very happy to be with you.
All right. Good to see you. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Andy and Leah, for that great overview.